Okay, so get this. Bangladesh has been making headlines, and not the usual, like economic miracle kind. Their longtime leader, Sheikh Hasina, is out after a whirlwind of protests, and things get really interesting. We've got reports, analyses, even voices from Bangladesh itself for this deep dive. So buckle up. Was this a true people power moment, or is there more to this story?
Well, what's so captivating about this situation is that it wasn't just like a sudden, an explosion of anger. There were signs, rumblings, discontent that had been simmering for years, kind of under the
Yes,
surface.
it seems like it all started with student protests back in 2018. They were upset about the government reserving a big chunk of civil service jobs, for certain groups like family members of war veterans. Is that right?
That's right. The students argued for a system that was more merit-based. And actually, they managed to get Hasina's government to get rid of those quotas, at least for a while. It felt like a victory, but looking back, it was just the first tremor of a much bigger earthquake to come.
Wow, yeah. And that earthquake hit in June 2024. The Supreme Court decided to reinstate those job quotas, and it was like someone lit a match to a powder keg.
Exactly. Those student protests, which had been simmering, suddenly flared up and spread like wildfire. It escalated into this massive anti-government movement.
Yeah.
And you have to remember, this is a generation that has grown up only knowing Hasina's rule, which became increasingly authoritarian over time.
Right. And the government's response, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly going to calm things down. They imposed curfews, shut down the internet, even issued shoot-on-sight orders. Things spiraled really quickly, leading to tragic clashes with security forces. Hundreds killed, thousands injured. It's hard to imagine the fear and the
It
chaos.
really is. But amidst all of that, there were these remarkable reports of soldiers refusing to fire on unarmed crowds. Think about that.
Wow.
Being a soldier in that situation, ordered to fire on your fellow citizens, maybe even your neighbors, that kind of defiance within the military itself speaks volumes.
Yeah, it's incredible. What struck me most about those accounts is the courage that it took for those soldiers to go against their orders. It's a powerful testament to the people's resistance, a regime losing its grip. Then came August 5th, 2024. The day everything changed, Hasina flees to India as the army makes it clear they won't suppress the protests any further.
It's a truly pivotal moment. In the wake of Hasina's departure, an interim government is formed. And who do they choose to lead it? None other than Muhammad Yunus, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Even more striking, two student leaders, both in their 20s, are appointed as advisors. Talk about a youth-led revolution.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this really dramatic timeline. Now let's unpack WHO was behind this upheaval. Was it truly a grassroots movement as it seems at first glance? Or was something else at play?
Well, to understand this, we need to look beyond those initial student protests.
Yeah.
While they provided the spark, their movement wouldn't have gained such momentum without the widespread support of the general public.
Right. But wasn't Hasina praised for her economic policies? How did those student protests focused on job quotas resonate with a wider population?
It's important to remember that for many Bangladeshis, those job quotas were just the tip of the iceberg. It was about years of pent-up anger at a system they felt was rigged against them. Yes, there was economic growth under Hasina, but it wasn't reaching everyone.
So those job quotas became a symbol of a much deeper frustration.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about the economy either. People were increasingly concerned about Hasina's growing authoritarianism. There had been suppressed elections, a crackdown on dissent. Remember, Bangladesh had to accept a bailout from the IMF, which meant they had to borrow money, but with strings attached that could make things harder for ordinary people. This all created a perfect storm of discontent.
So it was a confluence of factors that pushed people to the edge. It sounds like Hasina's government, by cracking down on those initial protests, only poured fuel on the fire.
Precisely. Their heavy-handed response only reinforced the public's perception that the government wasn't listening, that they were out of touch with the people's needs and frustrations. It backfired spectacularly.
Yeah. Speaking of external factors, there's a theory out there that sparked a lot of debate. Some are arguing that this revolution wasn't so homegrown after all.
Ah, yes, the theory put forward by economist Dr. Jeffrey Sachs, who's known for his, strong opinions. He argues that the United States orchestrated Hasina's ouster because she wasn't playing ball with their Indo-Pacific strategy.
He claims that Hasina's reluctance to sign certain military agreements with the U.S. and her close ties with China essentially made her a target. That's a bold claim, but our sources highlight some serious counterarguments to his theory as well.
Absolutely. One of the most compelling points is that there's simply no concrete evidence of U.S. involvement beyond Hasina's own claims. No smoking gun, no leaked documents, nothing to suggest a direct link between the U.S. and those leading the protests.
So essentially, it's her word against everyone else's.
Pretty much. And there's another glaring inconsistency with Sachs's theory. Why would the U.S. incite protests over something as specific as those job quotas? Seems pretty far-fetched, wouldn't you say?
It does seem like a stretch. And what about India? They were a key U.S. ally in the region and had a strong partnership with Hasina. Why would the U.S. risk upsetting that dynamic by ousting her?
Exactly. India was actually quite unhappy with Hasina's removal.
Hmm.
It just doesn't add up that the U.S. would jeopardize their own regional alliances to orchestrate this kind of regime change.
So while Sachs raises an interesting point, the evidence just doesn't seem to support it. It feels like one of those theories that sounds intriguing on the surface but falls apart when you start digging deeper.
I think that's a fair assessment. When you consider the lack of concrete evidence and the clear internal drivers behind the revolution, it becomes clear that this was a genuine grassroots uprising.
Okay, so we've established that public anger played a huge role, and there's little evidence to suggest any foreign orchestration. But to understand this event on a deeper level, we need to zoom out and look at the bigger picture. How does Bangladesh 2.0 compare to other revolutions we've seen around the world? Are there any parallels?
There are actually quite a few striking similarities. Take, for instance, the People Power Revolution in the Philippines back in 1986. Millions took to the streets to oust a dictator, and even sections of the military sided with the people. Sound familiar?
It does. And didn't Bangladesh itself go through a similar people-powered revolution in 1990, which led to the downfall of a military ruler?
Exactly. They have a history of this.
Mm.
And then, of course, there's the Arab Spring in 2011 with uprisings across countries like Tunisia and Egypt. Again, we see that same convergence of economic woes and political grievances leading to mass protests that toppled long-standing leaders.
So it seems there's a pattern emerging, people rising up against corruption, authoritarianism, and economic hardship. It's a powerful reminder that these forces can be incredibly potent.
What's fascinating is that these historical parallels help us understand the Bangladesh Revolution in a broader context. They demonstrate that this isn't some isolated incident, but rather part of a global wave of citizens demanding change.
It's a testament to the enduring power of people power. Now that we set the stage and explored the forces that ignited this revolution, let's dive into the aftermath. What happened once Hasina was out of the picture? Who stepped up to lead this Bangladesh 2.0, as they're calling it, and what were their priorities? So we've established that this revolution in Bangladesh was like a genuine homegrown affair. But toppling a regime is one thing. Building a new Bangladesh, this Bangladesh 2.0, that's a whole other challenge, right? Where do you even begin after a revolution like this?
It's a monumental task, for sure.
Yeah.
And the person tasked with leading this transition was none other than Dr. Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate we mentioned earlier. He became the head of that interim government.
Yunus is best known for his work on microfinance and poverty alleviation. Not exactly the first person you'd picture leading a country after a revolution.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes this so fascinating. Yunus, a respected economist, advocate for social justice, and a vocal critic of Hasina's government, signaled that this new Bangladesh would be different. His appointment was a clear commitment to genuine reform and a move away from the authoritarianism that had gripped the nation for so long.
But he wasn't alone, was he? Didn't those student leaders who sparked the revolution end up having a voice in this new government?
They did. And that's another sign that this wasn't just a power grab. Two student leaders, Nahid Islam and Asif Mahmud, both in their 20s, were appointed as advisors to the interim administration. It's a powerful symbol of a generational shift in leadership.
Having those young voices at the table must have sent a strong message that their demands for change were being taken seriously. But I imagine things weren't exactly smooth sailing in those early days after Hasina fled. What was the situation like on the ground?
There was definitely a period of turbulence and uncertainty. With law enforcement struggling to maintain order in the vacuum left by Hasina's departure, there were reports of rioting and looting.
That's understandable. Revolutions can be chaotic.
Of course. But here's what's remarkable. The people themselves stepped up to fill the void. There are accounts of students directing traffic community members, organizing safety patrols. It's a testament to the resilience and a real sense of collective responsibility emerging from the chaos.
Wow. So it wasn't just about tearing down the old system, but also about coming together to build something new, even in the midst of all that uncertainty. That's incredible.
It really is. And that interim government, with Yunus at the helm, moved swiftly to restore order and begin laying the groundwork for a more democratic future. They knew they had to act decisively to address the grievances that had fueled the revolution.
So what did this Bangladesh 2.0 look like in practice? What kind of concrete changes were they trying to implement? Did they just scrap those job quotas altogether?
They did. The Supreme Court got rid of most of the quotas, paving the way for a more merit-based civil service. But that was just the first step. They also announced plans for fresh elections, a new constitution that actually reflected the will of the people, and a serious crackdown on corruption. They were essentially hitting the reset button on the whole system.
It sounds like they were trying to create a system that was fairer and more responsive to the people's needs. But these things take time. Were people patient enough to let these reforms play out? Was there any pushback?
As you can imagine, not everyone was thrilled with this new direction. Some hardliners within Hasina's party saw the revolution as an illegitimate power grab, and there were concerns from others that the interim government would overstay its welcome and delay those promised elections.
So you've got that classic tension between the desire for swift change and the messy reality of building a new system. How did the new leadership navigate that?
They had to walk a very careful line, balancing the demands for justice and accountability with the need for stability and reconciliation. One of their biggest challenges was figuring out what to do with Hasina and her inner circle.
Right, because she fled to India, but that doesn't mean she just disappeared. What happened to her and those who were loyal to her regime?
There were loud calls for her to be brought back to Bangladesh to face trial for corruption and human rights abuses. But the interim government had to weigh the demands for justice against the risk of further destabilizing the country. It's a delicate balance.
It's that age-old dilemma, isn't it? How do you transition from a repressive regime to a more democratic system without descending into chaos or revenge?
Precisely. And it wasn't just about dealing with the ghosts of the old regime. The interim government also had to manage incredibly high expectations from a population that had risked everything for change.
It makes sense. After a revolution, people want to see results, tangible proof that their sacrifices weren't in vain. Did Bangladesh 2.0 deliver on those hopes?
It's still early days, and these things take time. But one of the most pressing challenges was addressing the issue of economic inequality. Remember, the revolution was partly fueled by the sense that only a small elite was benefiting from Bangladesh's economic growth.
So it wasn't enough to just change the political system. They also needed to create an economic system that was more just and equitable.
Exactly. They had to demonstrate that they were serious about creating a more inclusive economy where the benefits of growth were shared more widely. If those economic gains didn't reach, the people who took to the streets risked their lives for a better future. There was a risk of that simmering discontent boiling over again.
It seems like a monumental task, so how did they approach it?
Well, one of their first priorities was tackling corruption, which had been rampant under Hasina's rule. They introduced new transparency measures, strengthened anti-corruption institutions, and launched investigations into high-profile cases of embezzlement and fraud. It was about sending a clear message that things were changing, that the old ways of doing business wouldn't be tolerated anymore.
That makes sense. But beyond tackling corruption, what were some of the specific steps they took to address economic inequality?
They implemented a range of social programs aimed at improving access to education, healthcare, and affordable housing for low-income communities. They also introduced policies designed to promote job creation and support small businesses, particularly in rural areas.
So they were focusing on both short-term relief and long-term structural change.
Exactly. They knew that they needed to address people's immediate needs while also laying the foundation for a more equitable and sustainable economy in the future. And they understood that this wasn't just about economics, it was about social justice.
It's about ensuring that everyone has a chance to thrive, not just a select few. But let's be honest, economic reforms can be incredibly challenging. Were they able to make any real progress on this front? Were there any setbacks?
They faced considerable challenges, for sure. One of the biggest obstacles was resistance from powerful vested interests who benefited from the old system.
So those elites who had been profiting from the status quo weren't just going to roll over and accept these changes.
Of course not. They used their influence to try to obstruct the reforms, and there were certainly cases where progress was slower than many had hoped. But the interim government persevered, and they were able to achieve some notable successes.
Can you give us some examples of what they accomplished? What kind of tangible difference did their policies make in the lives of ordinary Bangladeshis?
Well, for example, their investments in education led to a significant increase in enrollment rates, particularly for girls from disadvantaged backgrounds. They also expanded access to healthcare in rural areas, reducing maternal and infant mortality rates. And their microfinance initiatives, building on Yunus's expertise, helped empower countless women entrepreneurs, enabling them to start their own businesses and lift themselves out of poverty.
So they were making a real difference on the ground despite the challenges they faced.
They were. It wasn't a perfect process, but they were laying the foundations for a more just and equitable society. And importantly, they were doing it in a way that prioritized the needs of the most vulnerable.
It's inspiring to hear that even in the midst of such turmoil, they were able to focus on those who needed help the most. But as we've discussed, it wasn't just about the economy, it was also about rebuilding democratic institutions. How did they approach that task?
They recognized that true democracy required more than just holding elections. It required a fundamental shift in the way power was exercised. So they set about strengthening the rule of law, ensuring judicial independence, and protecting fundamental freedoms like freedom of speech, assembly, and the press.
It sounds like they were trying to create a system where the people had a real voice, where their rights were respected, and where they could hold their leaders accountable.
Exactly. And that meant empowering civil society, encouraging civic engagement, and promoting a culture of dialogue and debate. They understood that democracy is an ongoing process, not a destination, and that it requires the active participation of citizens at all levels.
So they were focused on creating the conditions for a vibrant and participatory democracy. But what about those calls for justice and accountability that we mentioned earlier? Did the interim government address the abuses of the previous regime?
That was a delicate issue, as you can imagine. They established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate past human rights abuses and corruption scandals.
That seems like a sensible approach, a way to acknowledge the wrongs of the past without necessarily seeking retribution.
Exactly. It was about finding a path towards healing and reconciliation while still holding those responsible accountable for their actions.
It's that difficult balance between addressing the past and building a better future. But did everyone agree with this approach? Were there any concerns about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
Of course, there were differing opinions on how to handle the legacy of Hasina's regime. Some argued that the commission wasn't enough, that those who had committed serious crimes should face criminal prosecution. Others worried that pursuing prosecutions would only reopen old wounds and hinder the process of national reconciliation.
So navigating those competing demands for justice and unity must have been incredibly challenging.
It was, and it's a debate that continues to this day. But the creation of the commission was a significant step towards acknowledging the pain of the past and seeking a path towards a more just and peaceful future.
Okay, so we've talked about the domestic challenges facing Bangladesh 2.0, reforming the economy, rebuilding democratic institutions, and addressing the legacy of the previous regime. But what about the international community? How did other countries react to this revolution and the changes that followed?
The international community's response was initially quite cautious. Western countries, especially the United States, had a complicated relationship with Hasina despite her authoritarian tendencies. They were hesitant to fully embrace a revolution that had ousted a leader they had previously worked with.
So they had to sort of recalibrate their approach once it became clear that this was a genuine expression of the people's will.
Exactly. And once it became evident that the revolution was rooted in a desire for greater democracy and freedom, and not some foreign-backed coup, they gradually began to offer more support.
That makes sense. But what about India? We've talked about their close ties with Hasina. How did they react to her ouster and this new direction for Bangladesh?
India was understandably concerned about the upheaval and its potential impact on regional stability. Remember, they had invested heavily in their relationship with Hasina, and her sudden departure created a lot of uncertainty.
So how did Bangladesh 2.0 navigate those complex regional dynamics? Were they able to maintain good relations with both India and the West?
It was a delicate balancing act, to be sure. The new leadership made it clear that they wanted good relations with all countries, but they also emphasized that Bangladesh would chart its own course. They were determined to assert their independence on the world stage.
It's that second independence that we talked about earlier. It's a powerful statement, but talk is cheap, right? What were some of the concrete actions they took to back up those words?
One of the most significant moves was their refusal to sign any new military agreements with the United States. This is a major point of contention with Hasina, and it sent a clear signal that Bangladesh 2.0 wouldn't be pressured into taking sides in the growing rivalry between the U.S. and China.
So it was a rejection of that whole Indo-Pacific strategy that Sachs had claimed was behind the U.S.'s alleged involvement.
Exactly. They wanted to maintain good relations with the U.S., but on their own terms. They also reached out to other countries, including Russia and China, to diversify their partnerships and avoid becoming overly reliant on any one power.
So they were playing that classic non-aligned game, hedging their bets. But did this strategy actually work? Were they able to secure their place in the world and avoid getting caught in the crossfire of those geopolitical rivalries?
It's a complex question, and it's still early days. They definitely made progress in asserting their independence and building a more diverse set of relationships. But the geopolitical landscape is constantly shifting, and they will need to navigate those currents very carefully.
It's a constant balancing act. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the initial euphoria of the revolution to the messy realities of building a new nation. What does it all mean for Bangladesh's future? Was this truly a turning point, or was it just a brief interruption in a longer story of authoritarianism and struggle?
It's a question historians will be debating for years to come, but we can certainly look for clues in the aftermath. We can examine the actions of the new leadership, the aspirations of the people, and the broader trends shaping the region.
So let's dig deeper. What are some of the key indicators that suggest Bangladesh 2.0 might be a genuine break from the past? What are the signs of hope, and what are the potential pitfalls that could derail this experiment in democracy?
One of the most encouraging signs is the resilience and determination of the Bangladeshi people themselves. This was a revolution driven by ordinary citizens who risked everything for a better future. Their energy and commitment are powerful forces for change.
Right, because a revolution isn't just about changing leaders, it's about changing mindsets. It's about people believing that they have the power to shape their own destiny. And that kind of spirit is contagious.
Absolutely. And we're seeing that spirit reflected in the new leadership, particularly in that younger generation who played such a pivotal role in the revolution.
Those student leaders who became government advisors, they represent a new Bangladesh, right? A Bangladesh that's more democratic, more inclusive, more responsive to the needs of its people. But let's not get carried away here. There are also potential pitfalls, aren't there? What are some of the things that could threaten Bangladesh 2.0's success?
Well, for one, there's a legacy of authoritarianism.
Hmm.
Hasina's government had systematically eroded democratic institutions and created a culture of fear and repression. It takes time and effort to undo that kind of damage.
So it's not just about changing laws and institutions, it's about changing mindsets. It's about building a culture of democracy, which doesn't happen overnight.
Exactly. And then there's the economy. Economic hardship was a major driver of the revolution, and if the new government can't deliver on its promises of a more equitable economy, those simmering frustrations could easily resurface.
So economic justice is essential for political stability.
Absolutely. And let's not forget external factors. Bangladesh is in a complex and often volatile region with powerful neighbors like India and China who have their own interests and ambitions. Navigating those relationships will be crucial for Bangladesh's future.
It's like walking a tightrope, maintaining good relations with all sides while also asserting their independence. What about the role of the international community? Could pressure from outside forces derail Bangladesh 2.0?
It's definitely a factor. Western countries, especially the United States, will be watching closely to see how this experiment in democracy unfolds. Their support could be crucial, but it could also come with strings attached.
There's always that tension between wanting to support democracy and wanting to advance their own interests.
Yep. Precisely. And we can't overlook the role of technology in all of this. The internet played a huge role in the revolution, allowing people to organize and mobilize. But technology can also be used to suppress dissent, to spread misinformation, and to undermine democracy.
It's a double-edged sword. So as Bangladesh 2.0 moves forward, they'll need to figure out how to harness the power of technology while also safeguarding against its potential downsides.
Absolutely. Which brings us back to our central question, was this a genuine turning point?
Okay, after unpacking all of this, what's the verdict? Is Bangladesh 2.0 the real deal, or are we just seeing a temporary shift?
It's too early to say for sure, but there are definitely reasons for both hope and caution. The people have shown their desire for change. The new leadership has demonstrated a commitment to reform, and the international community is watching with interest.
So there's potential, but also a lot of challenges ahead.
Exactly. And that's what makes this story so compelling. Bangladesh 2.0 is a work in progress, a nation in transition, a microcosm of the global struggle for democracy and justice. It's a story that's still being written.
It's a story that's resonating far beyond Bangladesh's borders, I think. To understand the full significance of what happened there, we need to take a step back and look at this revolution, not as an isolated event, but as part of a much larger historical trend.
You're talking about the global wave of people-powered uprisings that we've seen in recent years.
Right.
From the Arab Spring to the protests in Sri Lanka, it seems like people all over the world are rising up to demand change.
Exactly. And I think understanding this broader context is essential for grasping the true meaning of Bangladesh 2.0. So let's shift our focus to this global phenomenon and explore what it tells us about the state of democracy in the 21st century. We've been deep diving into this incredible story of Bangladesh 2.0, this people-powered revolution that ousted a longtime leader and set the nation on an uncertain but hopeful, new course. But as we just touched on, this isn't just a story about one country. It's part of a much bigger picture, right?
Absolutely. What happened in Bangladesh fits into this global trend we've seen over the past couple of decades. This pattern of citizens rising up saying enough is enough, to corruption, to authoritarianism, demanding a say in their own future.
You mentioned the Arab Spring earlier, which, even though it had mixed results in different countries, showed that those seemingly unshakable dictatorships weren't invincible after all.
Exactly. Think back to those images of Tahrir Square in Egypt or the massive protests in Tunisia. They captured the world's attention. And while not all of those revolutions led to lasting democratic change, they showed people what was possible. They cracked open the door, planted seeds of hope.
And this wave of people power wasn't confined to the Middle East, right? We saw those incredible protests in Sri Lanka in 2022 with people driven to desperation by the economic crisis, literally storming the presidential palace.
Sri Lanka was a stark example of how economic grievances can fuel political upheaval.
Yeah.
People were fed up with corruption, with shortages, with the feeling that their government was completely out of touch. And we saw those same ingredients at play in Bangladesh.
It's that potent mix of political and economic frustration. And it seems like this trend is picking up steam. We're seeing protests against authoritarianism and inequality popping up everywhere, from Latin America to Eastern Europe to parts of the world that were once considered stable.
It points to a global shift, a growing awareness that the old ways of doing things aren't working anymore. People are demanding more accountability from their leaders, more transparency, more say in how their countries are run.
So what's driving this wave? Is it just about economic hardship, or is there something deeper going on?
Economic inequality plays a huge role, no doubt. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening in many parts of the world. People see a system rigged against them, and they're understandably frustrated.
It's that feeling that the elites are getting richer while everyone else is struggling to make ends meet. But it's not just about money. It's also about a lack of opportunity, the feeling that the system is unfair, that their voices aren't being heard.
It's about dignity, respect, and the desire for a more just society. And technology has amplified these grievances, connecting people across borders in ways we haven't seen before.
Yeah, social media has given a voice to the voiceless, allowing them to organize and mobilize in ways that were unimaginable just a few decades ago.
Think about how the internet was used during the Arab Spring, spreading information, coordinating protests. And then in Sri Lanka, those powerful images went viral and galvanized global support. Technology has become a powerful tool for social change.
But it's a tool that cuts both ways, right? Authoritarian regimes are also using technology to crack down on dissent, spread propaganda, and control the narrative.
It's a constant cat-and-mouse game. As activists find new ways to use technology for good, those in power are finding new ways to use it for their own ends.
So we're in this new era of digital activism where technology can be both a force for liberation and a potential weapon for oppression. It's exciting and terrifying at the same time.
It really is. And that brings us back to Bangladesh 2.0 and its place in this global landscape. What happened in Bangladesh is a microcosm of the broader struggle for democracy in the 21st century. It offers valuable lessons for both activists fighting for change and for all of us trying to understand this complex world.
So let's connect those dots. What can we learn from the Bangladesh Revolution about this wave of people power sweeping the globe?
One key takeaway is that even regimes that seem unbreakable are vulnerable. If enough people are determined to demand change, if they're willing to take risks and stand up for what they believe in, even the most powerful dictators can be toppled.
It's a powerful reminder that power ultimately resides in the people. What else can we learn from Bangladesh's experience?
Well, we saw how a seemingly small issue, those job quotas, could become a flashpoint. It tapped into much deeper anxieties and frustrations. This highlights the importance of framing demands in a way that resonates with a wider audience.
So it's not just about having a good cause, it's about being smart about how you communicate that cause, how you connect it to people's everyday lives.
Exactly. And then there's the role of the international community. The Bangladesh Revolution showed that even in this age of geopolitical rivalry, countries can still support democratic movements, even if it takes them a while to come around.
It took some time for the U.S. to get on board, but eventually they offered support. And even that rhetorical support can make a difference, right?
Absolutely. It can help legitimize a movement, put pressure on a regime, and create space for change.
So what does all this tell us about the future of democracy in the 21st century? Are we heading toward a more democratic world, or are we sliding backward?
The Bangladesh Revolution and these other uprisings remind us that the fight for democracy never ends. It's a constant struggle between those who want to control power and those who want to share it.
It's like that old saying, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Precisely. We can't take democracy for granted, even in countries where it's well established. We need to stay vigilant, engaged, and always defend our rights and freedoms.
And we need to support those fighting for those same rights and freedoms in other parts of the world, even when it's difficult, messy, or even when it doesn't seem to be in our immediate self-interest.
Because at the end of the day, the fight for democracy is a global fight. It's a fight for a world where everyone has a voice, where everyone has the opportunity to shape their own destiny, where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
Then that's a fight worth having. So to wrap things up, it seems like Bangladesh 2.0 is more than just a single event. It's a powerful example of a global movement towards greater freedom and self-determination. It's a story that's still unfolding, and it will be fascinating to see where it leads, both in Bangladesh and around the world.
It's a story that reminds us that change is always possible, that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, people, power can prevail.
And that's a message worth remembering. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll continue to explore these complex and fascinating stories here on the Deep Dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.